like to introduce you to a man who is known popularly as the Black Mozart. If you Google Black Mozart, probably this will come up at some point. His name is Joseph Ballon, the Cavalier de St. George's. So this man is really interesting and lived an extraordinary life at an unusual time. He was born on Christmas Day in 1739, and he was born in the Caribbean on a small island. I believe it was, no, I'm incorrect, but he was born, I know, in the Caribbean. Very interesting man. He's born to a slave mother at the time, and his father is somebody who belongs to French aristocracy. But because his mom is black, he is obviously at that time a mulatto, something that should have barred him from entering certain ranks. But his father has a very soft spot for him and raises him as a legitimate child, even though the father is married to a white French woman. They move to France, to Paris, and this young man is enrolled in some of the best schools with nobility at the time in France. He goes on to become a composer, violinist, a fencer, and he's not only good, I mean he's really good. He's considered by a lot of measures and standards of that time exceptional. I'll talk about two specific instances. So sometimes they refer to him as the god of the arms, which I think is a really interesting and lofty title. But the reason why this is because he was undefeated playing fence. Nobody had ever defeated him except for one person, and after that he kind of put fencing on the back burner. But he had a bit of an ego there. He goes to England. He's invited by the Prince of Wales to do like a demonstration of the work, fencing. While he's in England, he learns about the emancipation movement that's going on to free black slaves. He comes back to France. He's really geared and charged up and starts something in France. But that's not really the most interesting thing, I think, in his life. I mean, I think the most interesting thing in his life is the level of accomplishment that he allows himself. Of course, we can talk a lot about the privilege that he had, the education that he had, but so much of this man's life was informed by an extremely rich imagination of who he could be. He didn't need to be dictated to by what the status quo was. It was highly unusual, by the way, at this particular time in France, in Paris, for any mulatto to be of the middle class or better, and even when they were excluded from certain circles. So I told you he's a violinist and he's a composer, right? He applies to, actually he doesn't apply. His name comes up for the director of the Paris Opera, which is a very big deal at this time particularly. It's Hollywood glamour and it's really prestigious in the music world, etc. But he doesn't get it. But the thing that is interesting to me is that his name is taken very seriously, taken so seriously actually that these three big mamas, they're opera singers, they petition the Queen, and because of their petition, they basically say, because of our sensitivity and because of our social standing, we wouldn't know how to deal with somebody like this, and we couldn't be expected to take orders from a mulatto. So he doesn't get the position. He still, though, goes on to a really illustrious career. He becomes a soldier. This is around the time when the French Revolution is heating up, and they need soldiers to fight against some of the European powers that are coming to the defense of the French aristocracy. But he starts a regiment of about 1,000 men whom he leads. And this is really unusual even at this particular time, that here's this man who is leading this regiment. The regiment actually becomes known as something, the St. George's Regiment. So a really extraordinary life, and I think an example of somebody who embodies at the very core what it means to live your life informed by the richest parts of your imagination and not what is around you or what the world expects of somebody like yourself. leads me to where we are now, or where I see opportunities for redefining the world according to our imagination. Anybody who knows me knows, one, that I'm African, and two, that I'm really passionate about Africa. A lot of you probably were watching the World Cup this summer. This picture is a picture of some players from the World Cup. I think Ghana, Cameroon, and Cote d'Ivoire.
Yeah.
Okay. And that phrase, "Kinako," is kind of like the catchphrase from the World Cup. It is our time. It is time now. What was really interesting to me watching the World Cup was the reaction from a lot of people who are outsiders, but also from South Africans. There was a lot of argument about, is it worth it for South Africa to have spent the billions of dollars that we did on the World Cup, even though there's so much need in terms of social infrastructure, even basic infrastructure. I mean, the roads that were built were mostly roads that are going to be used by people like you, who have a lot of privilege, and not necessarily, I love you guys, but this is the truth, and not necessarily people who need the roads in the most remote village somewhere, right? Because that village is not the same in terms of what's attractive for tourists coming into the country. So the road would have been to the airport, for example. But what I found really powerful about the World Cup is what it did for South Africa and for Africans overall in terms of informing our imagination about who we can be. I think for a lot of Africans, this was probably the first time where we're on a world stage and are afforded something of equality in terms of all of these people from everywhere in the world coming to an event that we're hosting, and the event took off without a hitch for the most part. Maybe you didn't like the vuvuzelas, but
They're great.
I personally think they were great. Okay, but there's something to be said about what happens when you create not only events, but when you create things of beauty that speak to people's imagination and allow them to unleash something that's really powerful and can change the social fabric of societies. So I'm not sure what's going to happen from the World Cup. Is it going to change our societies? I'm not sure. But I'm really encouraged by what it has showed us about who we can be, and what that does for how we live our current lives and how that informs social change in Africa. I put this picture up here, one, to be provocative, because I think it's great, but also because I think this idea of beauty and of things that are of eloquent design, these stories are not told enough when it comes to Africa. And again, I think that there's a lost opportunity because we're not tapping into this very rich imagination that most people have. The 900 million people who make up Africa are just as concerned about beauty, just as concerned about design, just as concerned about reimagining the world we live in as we are. Ashobi Designs is a fashion company based in Cote d'Ivoire, right? Joanne? Yes. Based in Cote d'Ivoire, that is designing haute couture pieces, and they are selling, I mean, really well. They've been very well received. They've shown, not in New York Fashion Week, but at some really important platforms in the West as well. Arise magazine is a global magazine that captures a bit of this essence, this idea that there's something about beauty, about design, about our imagination that can inform social change. So this picture is the interior of a house in Soweto. This picture really moves me for a number of different reasons, but probably especially because it looks so much like the house I call home in Soweto. You walk in, so this would be the front over here, kitchen, bedroom, and like a very small room in here that you can't see. That would be the dining room. There's a window over here, there's probably a window over here. And these are the houses that people were living in, you know, with maybe 8, I mean in my grandmother's house there were 8 kids who were living in this house, and there'd be all kinds of relatives come over, etc. The reason why it moves me is because I think the photographer has captured something extraordinary. The beauty, the attention to where everything sits. There's design here. Somebody has really put a lot of thought into what should this look like, not what is the reality of what this is, a 3-room shack essentially, but what is the world that I want to live in? What would that look like? And I think it's a very, it's like a nod to being human in a certain sense, right? That you can be something more than just the walls that are around us, the 4 walls that contain you. And with that, imagination is the formation of a mental image of something that is not perceived as real and is not present to the senses. Imagination is the power of producing mental images and ideas. It is the ability to represent objects or states of affairs which cannot exist, which do not exist, or which do not exist here and now. Imagination is both condemned for its link with falsity and prized for its role in artistic creativity and human understanding. Imagination is more important than knowledge. This is a quote by Einstein. This is another picture that I think captures the essence of what I was talking about in the last photograph. This idea of people who see themselves as so much richer and so much more complicated than what we see them as. When we see this photograph, these people who live in a shack, and I know because Soweto was quite a famous artist at this point, but what he loves to do is take photographs of ordinary South Africans and he'll go into their homes. People live in a very humble home, and everybody else looking in on the inside would see only that they live in a very humble home. But I love the way that they choose to dress themselves, because I think that speaks volumes about who they imagine themselves to be and how they will shape the world to inform that reality which they live in inside of their heads. So the challenge that I will leave you with, or the thing that I hope you most take away, is to see the world truly through your imagination and to transform the world to be more like what you imagine it to be. Thank you.